In the American frontier in the early 1800s, the wildly eccentric mystic and wilderness preacher, Johnny Appleseed, was a literate nurseryman with an unmatched endurance for long walks in the wild and the planting of apple trees ideal for creating hard cider. This was consumed across the frontier in staggering amounts at this time. This same Johnny Appleseed, whose real name was John Chapman, became a member of the Church of New Jerusalem when he was 18, and became famous also for coming up to people with torn chapters of books in his hands and proclaiming good news fresh from heaven. But the chapters he gave were not chapters from the Bible. They were chapters from the writings of the great Swedish mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, the same mystic whose writings ended up being studied by the famous deaf and blind Helen Keller, who, in her book My Religion, wrote of Swedenborg's most famous book, quote, "When I began Heaven and Hell, I was as one groping in darkness who was suddenly flooded with light. Swedenborg's message has been my strongest incitement to overcome limitations. It has given color and reality and unity to my thought of the life to come. It has exalted my ideas of love, truth, and usefulness." In the studies of comparative mysticism, there are often characters who are so outstanding that the mere act of learning about their lives and reviewing their writings feels tantamount to piercing the veil of materiality and witnessing that divine light that is the source of our souls and the redeeming homeland from which we have all traveled and to which we must, at death, return. One such character so incredibly ahead of his time was the 18th century Swedish polymath, scientist turned mystic, Emanuel Swedenborg. The early decades of his life are exciting enough for an essay on their own, as the man's inventive genius produced designs of submarines, airplanes, and machine guns before anyone could produce their prototypes. And he developed an intuitive understanding of the hemispheres of the brain well before science had caught up to the idea empirically. A century before mainstream acceptance, he identified the cerebral cortex's central role in sensory, motor, and cognitive functions. He discovered the perivascular spaces, cerebrospinal fluid, and proposed somatotopic organization of the cortex, linking specific brain regions to body parts 100 years ahead of other scientists. He recognized the pituitary gland's arch gland role in neurological function, and deduced that brain undulations sync with lung respiration, not the heart, correcting contemporary assumptions. These and many more scientific achievements have Swedenborg's fingerprints all over them. But it is rather the later years of his life, following his pivotal spiritual experiences, that are the interests of this short study. As we will learn, Swedenborg made himself incapable of being reduced to a narrow category of historical personality, to the point that even Swedenborgians themselves hesitate to take all of the man's theological writings seriously. Nonetheless, there is no reason to doubt that Swedenborg believed his experiences exactly as they are written, documenting his own dreams, visions, channelings, out-of-body experiences, and theological beliefs in no less than 6,000 paragraphs of journals and over 25 books. Swedenborg was born in Stockholm in 1688 to a wealthy family. His father was the Bishop of West Gothland and a celebrity in his time, being appointed by King Charles XII of Sweden to be the bishop over the Swedish churches in Pennsylvania and over the church in London. Emmanuel's wealth allowed him to travel through England, Holland, France, and Germany from 1710 to 1716, and he ended up gaining the favor of the Swedish king, who offered him an assessorship to the College of Mines, where Swedenborg worked for 30 years, making many technical, scientific, and administrative innovations. In 1719, he was ennobled by Queen Ulrika Eleonora and named Swedenborg, gaining a rank of knighthood and becoming a member of the Royal Academy of Sciences in Stockholm. Emanuel disinclined to membership of any literary societies because he did not wish to spend his time discussing worldly matters, especially after he understood his divine calling was to aspire to a far more spiritual and important office. He also traveled into Venice and Rome, and two of his sisters married powerful men in their time, which further expanded Swedenborg's connections with the political and religious elite. But in his own words, the Lord himself graciously appeared to him, quote, "His servant, in the year 1743, opened my sight into the spiritual world, and enabled me to converse with spirits and angels, in which state I have continued to the present day. From that time I began to publish the various arcana that have been seen by me or revealed to me concerning heaven and hell, the state of man after death, the true worship of God, the spiritual sense of the word, with many other things most conducive to salvation and wisdom." And at least 6 major theological writings of Swedenborg were published anonymously between 1749 and 1758, probably to avoid the scrutiny of the relatively narrow-minded Christian dogmatists, churchgoers, and rationalist skeptics comprising much of the Swedish and European elite in his time. Swedenborg was already famous in scientific circles when he publicly revealed himself as the author of these works in 1763, at which time he was 75 years old. It is remarkable that 3 years later, the famous German philosopher Immanuel Kant would write a book about Swedenborg called Dreams of a Spirit-Seer, in which Kant investigates the various claims made by Swedenborg about visions, death, angels, and much more. Quote, "There lives at Stockholm a certain Mr. Swedenborg, a gentleman of comfortable means and independent position. His whole occupation for more than 20 years is, as he himself says, to be in closest intercourse with spirits and deceased souls, to receive news from the other world, and, in exchange, give those who are there tidings from the present, to write big volumes about his discoveries, and to travel at times to London to look after their publication." Kant is a major source for 2 of Swedenborg's famous psychic episodes, which we safely assume there were many more of. In one story, a certain widowed Madame Marteville was reminded by a goldsmith to pay a debt after her husband died. The madame was convinced that this debt was already settled, but found no proof among her husband's papers. This woman was already prone to, quote, credit the stories of soothsaying, interpretation of dreams, and similar wonderful things. And so she spoke of her trouble to Swedenborg, knowing that if he could contact deceased spirits, he could solve her problem. And so Swedenborg promised to help, and, quote, a few days afterwards reported to the lady in her house that he had obtained the desired information, and that the requisite receipts were in a hidden partition of a closet which he showed to her, and which, in her opinion, had been entirely emptied. A search was made at once according to his description, and together with the secret Dutch correspondence, the receipts were found, making void all claims. The more remarkable and famous event was that of a Stockholm fire in 1759. One afternoon, Swedenborg arrived in Gothenburg from England, and met with a party at the house of a merchant. After a short while he proclaimed, quote, with evident consternation, the news that just at that moment a terrible fire was raging in Stockholm, in the Södermalm. After the lapse of several hours, during which he had from time to time left the company, he reported to them that the fire was checked, and how far it had spread. This wonderful news was noised abroad the same evening, and the next morning was all over the town. Not until 2 days after did the first report from Stockholm arrive in Gothenburg. It agreed entirely, it is said, with Swedenborg's visions. From other sources, we learn that, on one night at dinner in Gothenburg, Swedenborg abruptly tells a manufacturer that he'd better get back to his cloth mills. This manufacturer, Bolander, did so at once, and found that a piece of cloth was about to catch fire by his furnace, and would have burned down the mill, had Bolander not arrived at his property during this short window of time. Bolander returned and thanked Swedenborg. In another evening, Swedenborg and one Dr. Rosen are discussing a book in the doctor's house, which he claimed he did not have a copy of. Swedenborg, however, informed him that he did have a copy of it in his attic, though how he could know such a thing was a troubling mystery. The doctor asked his wife to search for it, and she returned with the volume in hand. Like many mystical thinkers undergoing spiritual transformation, Swedenborg experienced profound states of internal combat. The demons he attributed as the source of abrupt, violent thoughts would cause him to see a knife and give him an impression of stabbing himself. Often his pride and sense of superiority would lead him into a sense of unworthiness and merit an adjustment through prostrations, songs, and prayer. One time, when overhearing a conversation about whether or not wealthy persons have melancholy, Swedenborg restrained himself with an inward smirk, knowing full well that the wealthy may become even more acutely aware of their spiritual flaws because they have the time and the means to fully correct them and often come up short. Swedenborg's admitted chief passion in life had been the pursuit of women, and so when he began his transformation, he wondered somewhat despairingly why this could suddenly vanish, and what had been the cause of his previous surrender to temptations. And temptation after temptation brought him face to face with the tests he needed to pass in order to pierce greater thresholds of spiritual wisdom. In his journals, he remarks, quote, "The whole day I was in double thoughts, which tried to destroy what was spiritual, as it were by contemptuous abuse, so that I found that the temptation was very strong. By the grace of the Spirit, I was led to fix my thoughts on a tree, then on the cross of Christ. And on Christ crucified, as often as I did this, the other thoughts fell down flat, as of themselves. I bore down with the same thoughts so strongly that it seemed to me I would crush the tempter by means of the cross and drive him away. Then after a while I was free. Afterwards I had to fix my thoughts upon it so intently that whenever I let it slip out of my thoughts and internal vision, I fell into temptation thoughts." Though he has been neglected by history, Swedenborg proved ahead of his time in so many respects. It is a struggle to keep up with him even in hindsight. He was practicing archetypal dream interpretation well before this kind of practice was systematized, and would often associate the most bizarre events in his dreams with his personal shortcomings. But considering he confesses in his writings to having the ability to speak with spirits on a daily basis, we must uncover how these interactions appeared and occurred, and what he learned through them. First, it behooves us to establish some degree of Swedenborg's legitimacy, which can be done through simple comparison. That is, we often find that Swedenborg will describe aspects of the spirit world and his mystical experiences and angelic interactions in precisely the same manner as those elite ancient mystics did well before him, and countless modern testimonies of near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, psychedelic and unitive experiences have done after him. For one, Swedenborg wrote, quote, "I can positively affirm that the objects which exist in the spiritual world are even more real than those in the natural. For that which is in nature added to the spiritual principle is dead, and does not produce reality but diminishes it." This conforms exactly to most out-of-body reports, where the experiencer confronts a non-physical reality that is orders of magnitude more real in every respect than the physical world. Swedenborg writes frequently of the body being the clothing of the soul, and the veil or the source of limitation, as the soul is, while animating the body, filtered and funneled and narrowed down in its natural capacities. For this same reason, most all of the great mystical schools have posited the physical body as a potential source of the greatest limitation, the association with which can result in frequent abuses and the continual weaknesses that lead one into temptation. Swedenborg, in his famous work Heaven and Hell, describes not these places in the abstract, as if from the basis of speculation, but makes clear, as he does in many works, that, quote, "This has been shown to me not by hearing, but by actual experience." He writes, "In the spiritual world, however, there is no space, but only the appearance of space. The angels' states of mind produce this appearance, and their changes of state produce the appearance of movement. Time in the spiritual world is not like time in the natural world. In the spiritual world there is only a succession of states, and this succession gives rise to the appearance of time. But since states are not fixed like times in this world, there is no time there as we understand it. In heaven there is no space such as in the world, nor time such as in the world, but instead of spaces there are states, and instead of times there are progressions of states. Space and time do not exist in the spiritual world. In their place are states of life, and these states give rise to appearances of space and time according to the quality of the spirits' lives. These and other testimonies are as good as a proof we are ever going to get that Swedenborg maintained an experiential understanding of the spirit world, as it comports with both ancient and modern testimonies. It cannot be understated how powerful these realizations are, that states of being are the sources of the experiential qualities of space and time is still something modern philosophers will struggle to grasp without having confirmative experiences for themselves. In this way, we can regard the here and now as far more real than place and time. For it is one state of being within the unchanging here and now that affect the experience of place and time. For, quote, "Space in heaven is nothing but the outward states that correspond to inner ones." And not only here do we find Swedenborg to be a legitimate experiencer, but also with his description of motion and movement in the spiritual state. Quote, "All motion in the spiritual world is the effect of changes of inner states, to the point that motion is nothing but change of state. This is how I have been led by the Lord into the heavens, and also to other planets in the universe. This happened to my spirit, while my body remained in the same place. This is how all angels move about, which means they do not have distances, and if they do not have distances, they do not have space. Instead, they have states and their changes." In the near-death experience and out-of-body experience literature, movement of the soul occurs at the speed of thought, and as soon as a soul buys into fear or into love, there are immediate changes. Swedenborg insists as well that in the heavenly planes, every soul is going to at once find themselves amid those souls of a similar quality, due to the perfection of the non-physical state. Like will attract like, and so it also follows that for those who get pleasure from harming others, they will find themselves in congenial and detestable company. For hell is not established in the Swedenborgian worldview as a means of eternal punishment or for any other low-resolution reason, but hell is an experience made possible by the perfect quality of the spiritual world, namely, the universe will support a soul in its efforts even if the soul wishes to create the idea of an experience full of suffering and despair. At the same time, should the soul naturally come to understand that love is intrinsic and unconditional, that love is actually the essence of God and the foundation of all things, the soul will at once experience that love to whatever degree they are able. Furthermore, Swedenborg's association with angels led him to believe that man is, quote, "governed of the Lord through angels and spirits, and that with everyone there are at least 2 spirits and 2 angels. By spirits man has communication with the world of spirits, and by angels with heaven." I am well aware that many will say that no one can possibly speak with spirits and angels so long as he lives in the body, and many will say that it is all fancy, others that I relate such things in order to gain credence, and others will make other objections. But by all this I am not deterred, for I have seen, I have heard, I have felt. In fact, Swedenborg insists that we are all naturally capable of speaking with spirits and angels, and this has been the case in ancient times. Quote, "But in the process of time, men so immersed themselves in corporeal and worldly things as to care almost nothing for aught besides. The way was closed. Yet as soon as the corporeal things recede in which man is immersed, the way is again opened, and he is among spirits, and in a common life with them." In testament to his first-hand knowledge of the spirit world, he describes his own near-death experience and his resuscitation. Quote, "I was reduced into a state of insensibility as to the bodily senses, thus almost into the state of dying persons, retaining, however, my interior life unimpaired, attended with the power of thinking, and with sufficient breathing for life, and finally with a tacit breathing, that I might perceive and remember what happens to those who have died and are being resuscitated." He describes the angels that were with him in his heart, who made sure that while he experienced this approximate to physical death, he did not have stray thoughts. And while he was being resuscitated, he perceived that the angels were actually making light of his fallacies and falsities, quote, "smiling at them not indeed as matters for derision, but as if they cared nothing about them." He describes the change in vision into the spiritual sight as if a membrane were rolling off of his left eye, and in many places he confirms that all of the sensory aspects represented in the human form are maintained in more powerful ways when one has been completely freed from the body. Quote, "Afterwards there seems to be something gently unrolled from the face, and perception is communicated to him, the angels being especially cautious to prevent any idea coming from him but such as is of a soft and tender nature, as of love, and it is now given him to know that he is a spirit. He then commences his life. This at first is happy and glad, for he seems to himself to have come into eternal life, which is represented by a bright white light that becomes of a beautiful golden tinge, by which is signified his first life, to wit, that it is celestial as well as spiritual." Swedenborg developed an extensive doctrine of correspondences, which held that everything in the material universe has its non-physical spiritual counterpart, down to the most minute detail. While Swedenborg certainly did not invent this, he nonetheless expands upon his own original conception of it, which of course, he would tell us, is not an idea of his, but a fact of the universe, communicated to him by countless experiences and dialogues with spirits. Swedenborg writes, quote, "The whole physical world corresponds to the spiritual world, the physical world not just in general, but in detail. So whatever arises in the physical world out of the spiritual one is called a correspondence. It is important to know that the physical world arises from and is sustained in being by the spiritual world, exactly the way an effect relates to its efficient cause." In this and in many other places, Swedenborg proves to have a total, if not more advanced, grasp of concepts quite familiar to the Platonists. The following is but one of 1,000 examples of this. Quote, "Because we have corrupted ourselves by living in ways that go against the design that rationality has recommended for us, we cannot escape being born into total ignorance, so that we can be led from there, by divine means, back into the pattern of heaven." And in another place he says, quite platonically, quote, "If anything were not kept in constant connection with the first, through intermediate means, it would instantly collapse and disintegrate." It is interesting to note that Swedenborg was aware of the Neoplatonist Plotinus, whose writings so frequently resemble Swedenborg's it can be uncanny. We know Swedenborg read Plotinus's works from Ficino's translations because he signed his name in 1705 to a Latin copy of Plotinus's works in the diocesan library of Linköping in Sweden. But it should be noted how Swedenborg distinguished himself from ascetics, or those who advocated for a spiritual life of abstinence and the abandonment of wealth and possessions. For Swedenborg quite wisely writes, quote, "If we would accept heaven's life, we need by all means to live in the world and to participate in its duties and affairs." And, quote, "It is all right to acquire wealth and accumulate any amount of assets, as long as it is not done by fraud or evil devices. It is all right to consume gourmet food and drink, as long as we do not invest our lives in such things. It is all right to be housed as graciously as befits one's station, to have conversations with others like ourselves, to go to games, to consult about worldly affairs. There is no need to give to the poor, except as the Spirit moves us." His writings are refreshingly plain and not difficult. The ideas communicated through them, on the other hand, he confesses, will make far more sense to those minds not trapped purely in physical thinking. In fact, Swedenborg embarked on the voluminous work of spiritually interpreting biblical texts such as Genesis, Exodus, Revelation, and more. Commentaries that would no doubt make the heads of modern Baptist ministers explode with frustration. For although Swedenborg considered himself a Christian, he was about as far removed from your standard 18th century Christian that has ever been known to history. This can be shown through the heresy trial of two of Swedenborg's followers in Sweden in 1768. Certain critics argued Swedenborg's theologies were heretical and mistaken, as many still do, although Swedenborg himself was never officially charged. In further removal from the comparatively stale advancements of spiritual concepts in his time, Swedenborg develops a scientific framework of divine providence in his book by the same name. Providence is defined simply as the protective care of God or nature as a spiritual power, but this says nothing of how or why that care is present. Swedenborg's explanations of providence include the following points, quote, "The universe as a whole and in every detail was created out of divine love, by means of divine wisdom. Divine love and wisdom radiate from the Lord as a single whole. There is some image of this whole in everything that has been created. It is the intent of divine providence that everything created, collectively and in every detail, should be this kind of whole, and that if it is not, it should become one. The Lord's divine providence works things out so that what is both evil and false promotes balance, evaluation, and purification, which means that it promotes the union of what is good and true in others." How fantastically fitting with the idea of the holographic universe, which posits that, like a hologram's image is made up of smaller identical images, in the smallest possible unit is also an image of the entire universe, in which case the infinite, unchanging principles of here and now are vindicated, as is the principle of oneness. Swedenborg develops more upon providence and indirectly offers explanations for what we now call synchronicity. In the same work, he criticizes materialists for, to put it in modern parlance, projecting their insufferably boring and uninteresting perceptions onto the universe, as if they were on a quest to make the mysteries of life out to be just as hopelessly prosaic as themselves. Quote, "The materialist is like someone who goes to a beautiful cathedral and hears an enlightened minister preach about divine matters, and then goes home and says, 'All I saw was a stone building, and all I heard was some complicated noise.' Or the materialist is like someone with poor eyesight who goes into an orchard gleaming with all kinds of fruit, and then goes home and says, 'All I saw was some forest and some trees.' When people like this become spirits after death, and are raised up into an angelic heaven where everything is in forms that portray love and wisdom, they do not see any of it. They do not even see that there is anything there." As a side effect of being able to lose our innate understanding of spiritual reality, the image of the divine that manifests everywhere is more difficult to see for what it really is. As Swedenborg explains, quote, "There is some image of divinity in everything that has been created, allowing for the fact that this image is less and less apparent as we come down level by level. It is even less apparent when a lower level, separated from a higher one by its closure, is clogged by earthly matter. In 1758, Swedenborg published what would become one of his most bizarre and criticized books, Other Planets, or in its full title, The Earth-like Bodies Called Planets in Our Solar System and in Deep Space, Their Inhabitants, and the Spirits and Angels There, Drawn from Things Heard and Seen. Swedenborg begins by explaining that since he has the gift of speaking with spirits and angels, he was granted opportunities to interact with beings from other planets, learning about their life, customs, and religions. We must reserve a fair bit of caution in this regard because we cannot know where Swedenborg is stating as fact something that he is misinterpreting, or otherwise we cannot always tell where we are listening to the man's imagination, his actual experience, or some fusion of both. For instance, he claims there are no such thing as angels or spirits who are not human, which in itself is likely false unless with the Latin word for human, Swedenborg is expanding the definition to encompass more meaning. He may be doing this and saying that these other beings are all human in a broader sense, that they have a spirit and intelligence and the capabilities that we do as well. He does describe seeing angels appear to him like a cloud with orbs of light at first, only to take on the shape of a human later, as if the beings can take the form of whatever they wish, and to appear more familiar to the observer. He also appears to be forcing the Christian ideology of Jesus being the Lord incarnate onto the rest of the solar system and beyond, which is definitely a weakness in regards to how optimistic we should feel about this text, to say nothing about the probability of human life existing on planets such as Venus and our moon in the same way that we live on Earth. However, he does describe these beings as spiritual beings, in which case they are not limited to the same degree as Earth humans are in our more dense physical form. He also implies that this communication is done through the universal language we call telepathy today. In one case, Swedenborg claims to have been taken to the vicinity of a planet far outside of our solar system, and he learns that they do not answer to any monarch or central government. They do not live beyond their simple needs of food and clothing, and they worship both a visible and an invisible God. In fact, it troubled these beings when Swedenborg pressed them with questions about their government because he implied that they were immoral and could not figure out how to live together without guarding their belongings or taking resources from others. But back in our familiar solar system, Swedenborg describes his interactions with spirits from Mercury, and in this example we cannot resist the idea that Swedenborg experienced some 18th century version of UFO phenomena. In fact, if he is telling the truth, he describes something very similar to the regular modern UAP phenomena of intelligent orbs of light. Quote, some of them also wish to appear not as men like the spirits of other Earths, but as crystalline globes. He says, I kept seeing a fairly bright, cheerful flame for the better part of an hour. The flame signaled the arrival of some other spirits from Mercury, but these spirits scrutinized things, thought about them, and communicated even more rapidly than the earlier ones. As soon as they came, they ran through the contents of my memory, but I could not catch what they were observing, because they were so quick. I kept hearing them say, yes, that's right. As for what I had seen in the heavens and the world of spirits, they said they already knew that information. I perceived that there was a large group of spirits accompanying them. Now, even if Swedenborg has unknowingly corrupted some of the details of his experiences, or we ourselves lack the clarity of his insights, his book represents an extremely out-of-place concept of the universe for his time, and many of us today could still find useful ideas from studying it. After all, when we eventually discover other planets with intelligent life, quote, what would this be for the creator of the universe, for whom it would not be enough if the whole universe were full? The creator is, after all, infinite. Swedenborg described seeing a planet with women sorcerers in green clothing, practicing something that filled him with horror. He also explained that on other planets it is common for the inhabitants to regularly speak with spirits and angels, and that many planets already know that the universe is teeming with life. He mentions some planets worshipping a host of angels that were sent to them by God, while some worshipped their God through symbolic images. He described meeting a spiritual version of Aristotle, who claimed that he believed in one God, but, quote, God's various attributes and qualities had been given names that others eventually worshipped as separate gods. Swedenborg also mentions certain angels telling him about a previous age on our planet where everyone spoke with perfect honesty, and there were no wars or strife. Quote, because of this, angels were able to interact with people on Earth in those days and lift people's minds almost entirely out of their bodily perspective into heaven. Angels were able to take people around heaven and show them grand and joyful things, sharing their own joys and happiness with them. These times were well known to ancient authors, who called them the Golden or Saturnian Age. For Swedenborg, the soul was like a hand wearing a glove, and while the hand still wears the glove, it cannot know what it truly is. The embodied life is at the very end of a chain of causes that stretches far into higher levels of being. At death, therefore, we will begin to retrace our steps in the chain of causes, and in remembering our total selves, we will find ourselves surrounded by angels and divine beings befitting our nature, and our options will be laid out before us in a limitless expanse. In conclusion, Emanuel Swedenborg is rightfully known as the most significant European mystic of the 18th century, who assures us that upon death we enter the world of spirits, and therefore should not be shocked when spirits are what we find. His writings are still relevant for spiritual seekers and can be read for free online through the courtesy of the Swedenborg Foundation. Thank you for liking and subscribing. Please consider supporting the channel through the Patreon or with a one-time donation linked below. Be well. Thank you.